I'm a nerd, which means that I know how to work with technical things sometimes. And I'm proud of being a nerd. All right. We have looked at our first two main subjects, the idea of the garden as a temple, and identified Adam's location, if you will, as the first earthly temple of God. Secondly, we took some time in the last lecture period to look at the nature of Adam's work, and we identified that his work was priestly and that he had the responsibility to fill the earth, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, and to fill the earth with image bearers, thereby God laying claim upon the whole creation as his own, as his sovereign realm. And so, as I said, though, at the conclusion of the last lecture, that we wanted to take a look at what the rest of the Scriptures had to say, particularly through the rest of the Old Testament, so that we would see that Christ does not just immediately appear on the scene, but rather the people of God have to wait a long time. Now, to be sure, I do believe that Adam and Eve were looking for Christ. I like to use this phrase, and I borrow it from politics a few years back. What did they know and when did they know it? In that I think we tend to think that the Old Testament saints didn't really know that much or look for or expect to see Jesus. But I think that the correct way to look at that is no, they did know to look for Jesus. They might not have known to the great extent and detail that we now know about Jesus. But when Abraham, for example, looked to Jesus' day, Jesus tells us this in John 8:56, that he looked to his day, saw it from afar, and rejoiced. And we see this in the great hall of faith in Hebrews chapter 11, that all of these saints did not receive these promises, but saw them from afar and looked eagerly for them. Okay? And I think one of the first points that we can even say along these lines is that when Eve first gave birth, she literally says, according to the Hebrew, I have begotten a man, the Lord, is what she says. And a number of commentators, Luther famously among them, said that I think that Eve believed that she gave birth to the seed of the woman who would crush the head of the serpent. So she and Adam were looking intently for the arrival of the seed of the woman, the one who would deliver them. What they didn't know is that it would just take a while, quite a while to say the least. But in that time, in that unfolding of the time, it is not that God was silent. Along the way, at each step of the way, he was whispering, as I said, telling his people, this is how it's going to be. And I'm going to give you a hint. I'm going to give you a foreshadow. This is what my son will look like. And so the first thing that we can take a look at is the Noahic covenant, God's dealings with Noah, in that there are parallels, obviously, that jump off the page between Adam and Noah in Genesis chapter 9. In Genesis chapter 9, as we're reading this narrative, if anybody who would hear this narrative or read it that is read earlier in the book in Genesis chapter 1, you would, of course, be reminded of Adam in the creation. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. All right, so here you have what is in essence a repetition of the dominion mandate, which should tell us that in some sense, Noah is like Adam. And in fact, when we look at the broader Noahic narrative, I think that we most certainly have to draw that conclusion. Because, for example, and I will just use a Hebrew phrase or two. I promise you I don't bludgeon you with Hebrew needlessly, but it's useful here at this point. In Genesis 1:2, it says this, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God, the Ruach Elohim, The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So you have the Spirit of God hovering over the face of the waters. Now, listen to Genesis 8:1. But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind. Elohim Ruach. Same words. Ruach can be translated either as spirit or as wind. And you can even perhaps see the conceptual similarity between the two, that a spirit doesn't have a body. And so he says, and God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. So here you have the Ruach from God over the waters, causing the waters to subside. So anybody who hears and reads this would automatically be drawn back to the Ruach Elohim, the Spirit of God, hovering over the waters. Just as you had the Spirit of God hovering over the waters, and the waters receding, revealing and bringing forth the dry land and the trees and the animals and everything else, so too you have this wind that causes the waters to recede. Dry land emerges from beneath the waters, and out of the ark come all of the animals, and of course the green verdure, if you will, the agriculture, the plants and what have you, all begin to grow. In other words, Noah's coming out of the ark in many ways mirrors and recreates, if you will, the opening chapters of the Bible with the creation of Adam and the heavens and the earth and the beasts of the field. Waters covered the earth in Genesis 1. Waters covered the earth in Genesis 7. Dry land emerges in Genesis 1:12. Dry land emerges in Genesis 8:11. God rested in Genesis 2:2. It's not as evident in the Hebrew or in the English text, but in Genesis 8:21, the text literally says that God smelled the aroma of rest. All right, so here you have this second Adam of sorts, this other Adam of sorts, who's given the dominion mandate. Be fruitful and multiply and fill all the earth. But what happens to Noah? He falls. And he falls in a way that is eerily like Adam's fall. You see, Adam fell in a garden. Noah falls where? He's in a vineyard. There's fruit around Adam. There is fruit around Noah. Adam sins with fruit. Noah sins with fruit of the vine. Adam was upright and righteous. Noah, quote unquote, walked with God. And he was an upright man, according to Genesis 6:9. Who else in the opening chapter walked with God? Remember, he walked in the garden. Adam walked with God in the garden. God's presence, remember, God's presence is not out of place in the garden. Sin is out of place. So Adam ostensibly would have walked in the garden with God, just as Noah walked with God. Adam sinned and was naked. Noah sinned and he was naked. God covered Adam's nakedness, and Noah's sons covered his nakedness. And nakedness is typically in the Old Testament associated not only with inebriation, but also with shame. Adam was naked and ashamed. Now, Noah didn't quite know that he was naked because he was passed out. He was that drunk. But nevertheless, it was shameful for him, and this is why his sons, at least two of them, covered his nakedness. And then here's the interesting fact, is I always thought it was odd as a kid that Ham's son is cursed. just for looking at the nakedness of Noah. That seemed a bit overkill to me. Now, there's some other things in the text that are going on that are possibly happening as to why it merits curse. But recognize this broader fact. Just as the Adamic narrative ended with curses and blessings, so too the Noahic narrative ends with curses and blessings. In other words, the seed of the woman is blessed, and they are blessed through the seed of the woman, and Satan is cursed. The seed of the serpent is cursed. Well, guess what? Sadly, but truthfully, the seed of the serpent was on the ark. And this is why Ham's son is cursed. Ham's son is cursed. Does anybody remember the name of Ham's son? Canaan. Now, this also goes to show the Israelites during the time of the Exodus, who was it that they were supposed to dispossess from the land? The Canaanites. And so God is telling his people through these scriptures, this is why you are dispossessing the Canaanites. Not only has their sin reached its limit and they are to be expelled from the land, but it's ultimately because they were cursed. And it goes all the way back to the events of Noah in the vineyard and the curse upon Canaan. And who is it that is blessed? The other two sons, do you remember their names? Shem and Japheth. What does God say about Japheth? He shall seek shelter in the tents of Shem. Shem is the father of whom? Abraham. The Shemitic peoples, the Semites, the Jewish people. And Japheth is essentially the father of the Gentiles. And so here in this promise, after Noah's fall, is that you have God telling his people through this promise, through this curse against the Canaanites, that the Gentiles will seek shelter in the tents of the Jews. So here, the promise that the seed of the woman is going to conquer the seed of the serpent is kind of fleshed out, if you will, in greater detail. But notice how the narrative is eerily familiar and similar to the Adamic narrative and fall. So God says, all right, I'll wipe the slate clean. I will purge the creation of its sinfulness. I will give you the dominion mandate again, and let's see if you can do it again. And what happens? Failure. What God has to show his people is it's not a question of the circumstances, it's not where you are, but rather you still carry the problem with you. I used to have folks in my congregation that said, we want to move out into the country. Well, why is that? Well, because we just think that the surrounding area here is just so sinful. And as gently and as kindly as I could tell them, I wanted to tell them, and I told them, you realize that when you move into the country, you're still going to take the problem with you. Because it's in your heart. It's in your heart. And this was, I think, the issue that God was essentially, at least on the broad scale, showing the creation, showing fallen humanity, showing the Israelites. And he does so in a way that is eerily familiar so that they recognize that this second Adam of sorts, he too failed. Now, when we get to Abraham, I think there is a dramatic shift in the narrative. There's a dramatic shift in the narrative. God makes a covenant with Abraham in Genesis chapter 17, for example. Let's look to Genesis chapter 17. And we could say that there are antecedent promises in Genesis 12, Genesis 15. But Genesis 17 gives us a clear statement about the nature of God's promise to Abraham. He says, when Abram was 99 years old, Genesis 17:1, and the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty, walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you, and may multiply you greatly. Now, there are some words in the Scriptures that when you hear them, bells should go off. radar warning lights, whatever. Multiply is one of those words. Where else have you heard that word? Be fruitful and multiply. Okay? That I may make my covenant between you and may multiply you greatly. Then Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, Behold, my covenant is with you. You shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be called Abraham. For I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. What was the extent of Adam's work in the beginning? Was it just local? How far did we say it was to extend? To the ends of the earth. Now, here's something that God says to him. And he gives him essentially the blessing of a king. Listen to Psalm 72, verse 17. May his name, the king, endure forever. His fame continue as long as the sun. May people be blessed in him. All nations call him blessed. Here, this is the blessing of a king. But what should not be missed is this. Do you notice the dramatic shift? What has God told humanity on 2 previous occasions in terms of the command? Be fruitful and multiply. Now, what has he told them? I will multiply you. It's no longer a command, it's a promise. And that is the significant shift. Earth-shattering, I would say. Because up until this point, remember, we're still in the very early narratives of the Bible here. Or roughly within a generation or so, if Shem, or a couple generations of the Tower of Babel, right after Noah's descendants. God called the creation into existence out of nothing, according to Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, according to Hebrews chapter 11. But do we also realize that when God called Abraham, that the Apostle Paul characterizes it as a creation out of nothing? As it is written, Romans 4:17, I have made you the father of many nations, in the presence of God in whom he believed, who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist. So Abraham's call itself is likened unto the creation out of nothing, except the massive, massive difference is it is no longer a command, be fruitful and multiply, but rather it is God promising to Abraham, I will multiply you, I will make you a blessing unto the nations. There's one commentator that says this, he says, quote, the narrative quietly insists that Abraham and his progeny inherit the role of Adam and Eve. There are interestingly 2 differences which emerge in the shape of this role. The command, be fruitful, has turned into a promise, I will make you fruitful. And the possession of the land of Canaan, together with supremacy over enemies, has taken the place of Adam's dominion over nature. Remember, God does not change Adam's job. He instead is going to send someone faithfully to complete it. And in this case, what God is saying is, I will fulfill the dominion mandate that you have failed to do, not only in Adam, but also in Noah. And I'm going to do it through my promise to you, Abraham. When we get to the Mosaic covenant, we first should recognize that the Mosaic covenant is organically connected to the previous covenants that have gone before. Because in Exodus, for example, Exodus 2:24, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So here, these events of the previous covenants with with Abraham especially, are further connected to what God has promised to Abraham. But take a look at Exodus 2:7, and here's where you get warning lights go off as 2 of these key words appear together in the same context to show that God is fulfilling his promise to Israel even though they are imprisoned in Egypt. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. So here, what God is whispering through the narrative here is that even though you're in slavery, even though you are being oppressed, I am fulfilling my covenant promise to Abraham, and I am making you fruitful, and I am multiplying you, as Adam was supposed to do, but now, and Noah failed to do, but now, as I promised to your forefather Abraham, I am doing, even though you're suffering and being persecuted. I am faithful, even though the circumstances wouldn't lead you to believe it. Which, quick hopscotch out, I think that this is ultimately a branch of hope for us, in the sense that even though the church may be persecuted, even though martyrs may suffer for the cause of the gospel of Christ, even though the church may appear to be small and weak, we will be fruitful and we will multiply and we will fill the earth, not because of us, but because of his faithful promise. But nevertheless, we've already seen the parallels between the first earthly temple and the tabernacle, the 7 days of creation, and the 7 speeches for the construction of the tabernacle. Both Eden and Sinai were located atop mountains, but there are further continuities between the two contexts. According to Luke chapter 3, verse 38, Adam is called God's son. Adam is called God's son, which you see when I brought up the connection in terms of bearing the image is essentially being a son. Adam bears God's image. Adam, therefore, is God's son. But the scriptures explicitly identify Adam as God's son in Luke's genealogy, which goes and traces Christ's genealogy all the way back to Adam. Israel, according to Exodus 4:22, is called God's son. Exodus 4:22, and the Lord said to Moses, reading in verse 21, when you go back to Egypt, see that you do before Pharaoh all the miracles that I have put in your power, but I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Then the Lord shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn son. I say to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. If you refuse to let him go, behold, I will kill your firstborn son. So here, there are these parallels between the two sons of God. And I just hop out to make a quick comment. We won't fill it in until later. Adam and Israel are God's faithless sons. Jesus is God's faithful son. We also see parallels between the garden temple and the promised land. In Exodus chapter 13, the promised land is described as a land flowing with milk and honey. And it's also described as a land filled with fruit. We also see that just like the sanctity of the garden was to be preserved, so too Israel was going to enjoy peace in the land because God was going to chase off all of their enemies. Leviticus chapter 26, verses 6 and following, Leviticus 26:6, I will give peace in the land, and you shall lie down, and none shall make you afraid. And I will remove harmful beasts from the land, and the sword shall not go through your land. Just as Adam dwelt in the garden and did not fear the beasts, Israel was supposed to dwell in the land, not fearing the beasts or their enemies. You shall chase your enemies, and they shall fall before you by the sword. 5 of you shall chase 100, and 100 of you shall chase 10,000, and your enemies shall fall before you by the sword. I will turn to you and make you fruitful and multiply you, and will confirm my covenant with you. You shall eat store long kept, and you shall clear out the old to make way for the new. I will make my dwelling among you, and my soul shall not abhor you. And I will walk among you, and will be your God, and you shall be my people. These are all promises that you see anticipated first and foremost, or at least are evocative of Adam's place in the garden, with the exception maybe of the enemies. But even then, the enemies are being chased away. Even the repetition of the idea of being fruitful and multiplying. Their granaries are stuffed, and God walking in their midst as he walked in the Garden of Eden. So here are those connections. There are still yet further connections in terms of Israel's work. Israel, according to the Old Testament, was supposed to be a kingdom of priests. According to Exodus 19:6, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. The fact that they are a kingdom conveys their kingly function and role, just as Adam was a king. The fact that they are priestly also conveys, I think, the connections to Adam's priestly functions. But here, Israel was also supposed to have a prophetic function, and that they were supposed to spread the news of the gospel, if you will, unto the nations. According to Isaiah 49, verse 6, it is too light a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and bring back the preserved of Israel. I will make you as a light for the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth. And so here they were supposed to spread the gospel to the ends of the earth. And then just like Adam, well, not just like Adam, there are some differences. I don't want to, iron over those some important differences, but in very similar a way to Adam. Just as Adam was told, if you eat of the tree, you will die. So Israel is told, if you disobey. Now, this is on a national level. This is not on a personal level, but this is on a national level. If you disobey, ultimately, I will carry you away into exile. And how is that exile characterized according to Ezekiel chapter 37? They're in a valley of what? Dry bones. Exile is likened unto death. Do you see the similarities here in the terms of Adam disobeys and is exiled from the presence of God? Israel as a nation is disobedient, and they are exiled from the presence of God. That, I believe, is the ultimate significance of Adam's death. We look at Adam's death and it says, you shall surely die in the day you eat of it. And we think, well, look, he didn't die. And I would say, what would it mean if you were dwelling in the presence of God and you were to be cast from his presence? Would that be anything less than death? In a sense, living in the land of death because you are no longer in the presence of God. And that is precisely the way that Israel's exile is described, as being dead, because they are exiled from the temple. They are exiled from the presence of God. And so here, Gerhardus Voss, he was professor of biblical theology at Princeton Seminary during the days when B.B. Warfield was there in the early 20th century. He writes this in his biblical theology. He says, the abode of Israel in Canaan typified the heavenly, perfected state of God's people. It foreshadowed it. Under these circumstances, the ideal of absolute conformity to God's law of legal holiness had to be upheld. Even though they were not able to keep this law in the Pauline spiritual sense, yea, even though they were unable to keep it externally and ritually, the requirement could not be lowered. When apostasy on a general scale took place, they could not remain in the promised land. When they disqualified themselves for typifying the state of holiness, they ipso facto disqualified themselves for typifying that of blessedness. They had to go into captivity. And so they are exiled from the presence of God. Now again, I'll hop out here for a second and say this. Jesus is completely obedient to the law of God, but is nonetheless exiled. He's crucified where? Outside the camp. He undergoes exile so that we don't have to. And in terms of the architecture of the new temple, the last temple, the new Jerusalem, where are the dogs, the sorcerers, the adulterers, the cowards, the liars? Where are they? outside the city. When I tell you all of this, is you begin to see the architecture of these temples and how it's, in a sense, been the same throughout redemptive history. And all of a sudden, the Bible gets to be very small, and you begin to see how, it's been whispered and whispered and whispered until it finally comes in Christ, and then with the consummation, and all of a sudden, all the rest of this makes sense. Now, there are other elements of what we would call new creation foreshadowing. In other words, if the Scriptures talk about the new heavens and earth, well, how do we understand what the new heavens and earth are unless we first understand what? The old. You guys got that right there. That was great. The old heavens and earth. So that, for example, Genesis 1:2, the earth was without form and void. Tohu vabohu. There we go, with that Hebrew. And darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Now, you hear that word hovering, and I think in the day and age in which we live, we think of a helicopter, hovering. That's not the kind of hovering that's in view. The kind of hovering that's in view is, think of a bird on the wind as it's kind of hovering. Maybe you've seen a seagull or something like that hovering in the wind at the beach. That's the kind of hovering that's in view. Now, here's the interesting point. There is only one other place in the entirety of the Old Testament where that one term occurs, hovering. One other place. Genesis 1:2 and Deuteronomy 32. Deuteronomy 32, verses 10 and following. Listen closely. Talking of Israel, he found him in a desert land, in the howling waste of the wilderness, in the tohu vabohu. All of a sudden, it's evocative of a term from Genesis 1. He encircled him. He cared for him. He kept him as the apple of his eye, like an eagle that stirs up its nest, that hovers over its young. The only other occurrence of that term, hovering, two places in the Bible, Genesis 1:2, Deuteronomy 32:11, that hovers over its young, spreading out its wings, catching them, bearing them on its pinions. The Lord alone guided them. No foreign god was with him. Now, so you have the Spirit of God hovering over the creation waters. The creation emerges. You have the Ruach Elohim over the waters of the flood. What else do you see hovering over those waters later in that narrative? Noah sends out what? A dove. Dove goes out over the waters. Israel's deliverance from Egypt is characterized as coming out of the emptiness, the tohu, the void, coming out of and having God hovering over him like a bird. Now follow me. According to Haggai chapter 2, verse 5, the Lord, during the Exodus, placed his Spirit in the midst of Israel. According to the covenant that I made with you when you came out of Egypt, my Spirit remains in your midst. In Isaiah chapter 63, verse 11, the prophet is talking about a grand second Exodus that will occur in the last days, and he likens it to the first Exodus. Then he remembered the days of old, of Moses and his people. Where is he who brought them up out of the sea with the shepherds of his flock? Where is he who put in the midst of them his Holy Spirit? So Israel is coming up out of the sea, and the Spirit comes upon them. And the Spirit's activity, according to Deuteronomy 32, is described as bird-like activity. Now, I can't help myself. Do you see that picture anywhere else? Baptism of Jesus. So that by the time you get to the baptism of Jesus, what appears to be an ordinary event, in the light of everything that has gone before, is anything but ordinary. It is God, and I'm way getting ahead of myself, but it is God saying, this is the one that we have been waiting for. This is the last Adam. Everything else has been in anticipation. It's like I like to say, it's like as if the whole Old Testament is just leaning forward in anticipation of Christ, so that when he comes on scene, you're like, well, of course. Absolutely. This makes absolute total sense. But if we read that account and we don't know all of these previous manifestations of these patterns, if you will, these shadows and these types, we miss it. We just think, all right, well, Jesus got wet. And okay, I guess, yeah, the cloud split open and God said, this is my son in whom I'm well pleased, but where are the miracles? Let's talk about the miracles. But if you realize this, you're like, wow, this is amazing. This is absolutely amazing. And here's what else is fascinating, is that another unique phrase in all of this, in these early accounts, is that the phrase, the Spirit of God, the Spirit of the Lord, is a very rare phrase in the Old Testament. We don't think of it as being rare because we're so accustomed to it. We read it all over the New Testament. But in the Old Testament, it's extremely rare. Can anybody think of one of the contexts in which it appears? Prophets. Yeah. So the prophets have the Spirit descend. But how about, can you think of any tabernacle building activities? I probably gave it away that way. Dedication of the temple, but the artisans who built the tabernacle. Listen to Exodus 31, verses 2 and following. See, I have called by name Bezalel, the son of Uri, son of Hur, the tribe of Judah. I have filled him with the Spirit of God, with ability and intelligence, with knowledge in all craftsmanship, to devise artistic designs, to work in gold, silver, and bronze, in cutting stones for setting, and in carving wood, to work in every craft. I've heard some people explain this as saying, look, the Spirit of God enables them to do all this stuff, therefore the arts and painting and music and all of these things. I don't want to speak against those things at all. I mean, I think they're good and they're important. But that particular passage is talking about the artisans being equipped by the Spirit to build the temple, the tabernacle. Likewise, hopping out again, when Paul talks about the gifts of the Spirit in 1 Corinthians 12 that are distributed by the Spirit amongst the church, they are for the building up of the church, which is, again, rooted in this creation imagery. We also can say here, in terms of there is the repetition of the Sabbath. You find the Sabbath in the creation account. By the Sabbath in the creation account, God rested from his labors. And likewise, you also find the Sabbath repeated to Israel in the Decalogue. Exodus chapter 31, verse 17, it is a sign forever between me and the people of Israel that in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. There are some other activities that we want to take note of. So we've seen some of these activities in the broad, but let's go back and revisit for a few minutes Abraham's activities before we wrap this one up. Is that along Abraham's pilgrimage, we can say that Abraham constructed miniature temples. In that with the theophanies, that is, the appearances of God to Abraham, we could say that those are foreshadows of God's eventual appearances, whether it be at Sinai, whether it be at the tabernacle, but ultimately those appearances of God, I think, are reminiscent of God's appearance with Adam in the garden temple, the place where God met with his people. The altar, if you think about it, was the place for sacrifice, which we would call this as priestly activity. Cain and Abel built altars, although we know, and offered sacrifices, although we know that Abel's sacrifice was superior to Cain's. Noah built an altar to conduct a sacrifice. This is priestly activity. But what's interesting is that you often find the patriarchs building altars on mountaintops. Jacob built one at Bethel, which is on an elevated surface, which is on a mountain, the gate of heaven. And then think of it, in Genesis 12:6 and in Genesis 13:18, the patriarchs set up altars in the midst of tree groves, the terebinth trees of Moreh, the terebinth trees at Mamre, which is evocative of worshiping God in the midst of the trees on the mountain in Genesis 1 and 2. Which, correlatively, we can also make the observation, why is it that the Old Testament Israelites had a problem with idolatry, and where was that idolatry carried out? High places, the mountaintops. They were illegitimately trying to establish other high places, if you will, mountaintops, where they could worship God. And God said, no, my worship is to be done here at the tabernacle and then later at the temple. Which incidentally, that's what's connected to the Tower of Babel. It was in essence, I think we think of it maybe in terms of the Tower of Pisa, maybe before its leaning, but we think of it as this kind of building, like a huge superstructure. What do you call a tall building? Skyscraper. I don't know. I couldn't think of that. We think of it like a skyscraper, but instead we should think of it as a mountain, more like, and that they were building a human mountain so that they could get to God. But again, illegitimately so. So all of this is to say is that at each and every step of the way, we can say that God is whispering through the text, whispering in the text, saying that my son is going to arrive. He's going to look like this. You see this especially with Solomon, and you see Solomon echoing Adam's wisdom. Adam was wise. How do we know that Adam was wise? Implicitly from the text. And this is what a number of commentators have said. Yeah, he named the animals. That takes some doing. And we know that Solomon is wise, not only because of what we read in the Proverbs, but that many of the nations came to gather to Solomon to listen to his wise teaching. And Solomon is one of the first kings. He's one of the first manifestations of a king who makes wise decisions apart from the Urim and the Thummim, or the holy dice. That's how I usually, loosely describe them. The Urim and the Thummim were the way that you cast lots. Lord, what should we do? Do we go? Do we leave? Yes, we go. No, we stay. What do we do in this difficult circumstance? Let's roll the Urim and the Thummim to reveal God's will to us. But when Solomon has that thorny question of the two women claiming that the child is theirs, respectively, Solomon reveals his wisdom, and he says, divide the child in two. That revealed who the true mother was, because she said, no, I would rather that the child live than for him to be killed. And the text there says, and all of Israel marveled at Solomon's wisdom. And what does Solomon build? Solomon builds a temple. But we also know that Solomon in the end sinned and was sinful because of his many, many wives, his 1,000 wives. So at each step of the way, God is whispering, my son will look like this, my son is going to come and he's going to build a temple. Because that was the job that he originally gave to Adam. I'm going to send somebody who will faithfully execute the work that the first Adam failed to do, and every single person thereafter has failed to do. Just as Adam was faithless, Israel, my son, was faithless, but God incarnate, the second person of the Trinity, Jesus Christ, my Son, will be faithful to complete and carry out that work. All right, we don't have... we're ending a few minutes early here because we're supposed to go to lunch at 12:15, but I always like to say if I don't have anything else to say, then I'm not going to use up the time. You don't need to hear me blather on. And so we'll break for lunch, and we're going to come back from lunch at 1 o'clock. At 1 o'clock, but Stan, maybe we have some announcements.